Hey guys, it's time to Nefis and chill, and ever since the Markarth PTS came out, so many people kept asking us at ESO University, what the heck is the best in-slot or best raid composition for Markarth DLC, otherwise known as Update 28. It seems a lot of you have missed the point entirely of my first raid composition video, which encourages you to critically think for not just yourself, but for your group's needs or desires when it comes to making up the itemization and classes for your PvE Trials raid roster in the Elder Scrolls Online. And I think a lot more people have also misunderstood the point of me theory crafting these compositions, thinking they absolutely need to follow the examples given, despite them not being a group that's going for world record scores or optimizing themselves. As a forward, a small amount of groups, including my raid team, Berserk, have been testing, or at least attempting to test, quite a lot of things in raids this patch, but the following things I'm going to talk about, raid compositions are still a bit cloudy because of the constant crashing issues that prevent us from testing in ESO, because unfortunately ZOS has not fixed the constant crashing issues, along with a plethora of other bugs for the Markarth DLC for the past month or so now. But that's a different conversation we can take to a different video entirely. Since we're basically 1/3 through of an entire patch with no permanent fixes in sight, I should warn you that some things I'm going to talk about in this video will be either made irrelevant or more relevant to optimizing your raid groups as time goes on. And of course, I can't make predictions for the next patch. Regardless though, I think a majority of the things I'll bring up, we pretty much all have a clear idea of from preliminary testing and the rating we could afford to do so far into Update 28. If you have not watched my first raid composition video, or you need to be brought up to speed for the last patch, otherwise known as Stonethorn DLC, the videos will pop up at the end of this video and are also linked down in the description below. Otherwise, watching this is pretty much a waste of your time if you don't understand the basics of puzzling together a raid composition. Just a brief recap, we still have the same benefits and minors or majors each class can bring to a 12-person trial team. Dragon Knights can bring Stagger, Minor Brutality, Engulfing Flames, Igneous Weapons. Nightblades bring Minor Savagery or Damage. Necromancer brings Major Vulnerability or Damage. Templars give minor sorcery, minor fracture breach, or damage. Wardens bring minor toughness, major resolve, minor vulnerability, and so forth. Sorcerer brings potentially 1k penetration through crystal weapon, although that's may not be practical for a lot of groups. Minor prophecy is also brought in if you're a magic at DPS composition. Other puzzle pieces will include this patch tidbits of important information for a lot of teams to consider, including strategy, content, itemization, the introduction of minor brittle, the introduction of 2 mythic items such as Ring of the Pale Order and Pearl of Elnafay, significant skill changes and updates to the base game combat system, including the major minor system, and also changes regarding the balance between stamina and magic DPS compositions. To put it, to summarize this patch, it's a very, very open-ended patch. It's it's probably one of the most open-ended patches, and probably one of the most fun patches to theorycraft raid compositions. So I'm gonna try to break down each aspect of this patch. I might go a little all over the place, so do bear with me. So let's start with the important tidbits of information. I've previously covered a lot of this both in the ESOU Discord and also in YouTube videos, such as the unannounced changes to Minor Lifesteal. For whatever reason, if you have not watched my video or anything on that, Minor Lifesteal, it was changed intentionally by the devs to not proc certain things, such as a Warden's Minor Toughness. So let's say if you put an altar down, or you put vines down or whatever, it won't proc Earthgore, it won't proc Symphony, it won't proc Minor Toughness. Now this may seem at a glance perhaps inconsequential to a lot of you, but it is pretty big, pretty significant, because while we were theory crafting for a lot of things, we realized, oh wait, well we can't just have you put an altar down and have you proc Symphony or whatever. It's because, like, for example, let's say you're a healer, and you have SPC, and a fight may require you to go elsewhere or something, and in the past you would have SPC proc, or perhaps you're a tank and we moved SPC to the tank for a score push or something, but the tank can't proc SPC anymore because minor lifesteal doesn't proc SPC anymore. So this is a pretty big change that everyone needs to kind of know about. So again, this is something you have to take into consideration. Now, Alkosh, there's been so much discussion about Alkosh because, you know, there were a lot of changes to the major minor system, including penetration. So things like major fracture or major breach, which is now major breach. Now it's 5,948 resistance debuff. Minor breach, which actually comes onto a packaged now into pierce armor, a sword and ward skill morph, which stacks both major breach and minor breach, is 2,974. So a lot of these changes, the penetration increases, which are intended, I'm assuming, to make things more friendly for newer groups or newer players, definitely also affects the top end of the game when you're considering score pushing or optimizing your group. This means potentially for Magicka DPS compositions, you won't really need Alkosh for boss fights. Indeed, you actually really don't need Alkosh for boss fights for Magicka DPS compositions, as you can see from this quick math over here. But for stamina DPS compositions, it's also kind of debatable, and I'll talk on that later. For Alkosh, for stamina DPS compositions, for boss fights, it's needed if you can't make up for the penetration as shown here, 2,455. So, but for trash fights for both Magicka and stamina compositions, you do need Alkosh, and I would highly recommend it because you can't obviously apply all the armor debuffs on every single target with Pierce Armor or whatever other source like Crusher. So that's definitely something you need to consider. Now, for boss fights for Magicka DPS compositions, a lot of people are asking, well, what do you replace Alkosh with in the Magicka DPS composition? Well, there's a whole variety of item sets out there we can look at. Obviously, the most obvious one for optimizing or min-maxing is going to be Powerful Assault. And, you know, a lot of people are like, well, that's kind of a waste because depending on the fight, you know, some tanks or both tanks may be in a static position. And the tank in a static, one of the tanks at least, will be in a static position or in a position, in a very inconvenient position to proc Powerful Assault. But that's, again, dependent on the fight, and that's kind of up to groups to do it. But if I had my say for a lot of the content, probably just PA, honestly, just to guarantee the PA uptime. And obviously, a lot of people also misunderstand how PA works. A lot of people reported PA as being bugged, that, oh, it's targeting the same exact people. Well, that's how it's always been. Even before it started affecting more people, post Stonethorn, Powerful Assault is based on proximity. We've tested this many, many times. It's working fine. It's working in tandem. It's based on proximity from the caster, but people don't seem to understand that. So how you organize things, if you ever watched, you know, Berserk Raid and VHoff on my YouTube channel or whatever, or on Twitch when we stream raids, you'll notice that we do position DPS in certain spots. For example, on the Archcustodian boss, we put DPS in at a certain distance away from the other group, and we have the caster of Powerful Assault casted from a certain distance from that group, and then for the other group in a sort of mirror position. But anyway, I went off on a tangent about PA, but PA is definitely an option to replace Alkosh. Now, Gallonway, because a lot of people are saying, I don't know why, but for min-maxing, for optimizing, I don't think Gallonway is a solid option at all. I mean, I think Gallonway definitely is noticeably good in a few fights, including Lord Falgrav and Hardmoon, but I don't think it's good for everything, and a lot of people try to make Gallonway work in fights where I just think it's either too risky to make it work, or it's just kind of like whatever. So, other sets that may have other, you know, raid teams consider, Worm, maybe like 2 tanks going down back and forth on Zamaja in Cloudrest portals could wear Worm or PA or something else. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I did test. I mean, you could also, you know, for progression groups, and I'm not really wanting to focus on progression groups, but as a suggestion, for progression groups, I've also tested Eternal Yokeda. If you want more mitigation or more survivability, that is definitely easier on the tanks. And I'll explain why a lot of groups will prefer Magicka DPS compositions, regardless of the fact that maybe if, you know, the meta, or I hate using that word, but if the meta or the top end groups favor stamina for certain content, why most people will still go Magicka. I'll explain that later. Now, the minor major system I kind of touched upon. It's really important that you guys review this. I don't know why people keep asking me questions when they didn't read the patch notes, and it's like it's all right there. It's all in the patch notes. Otherwise, you can visit this link down in the description below to kind of go over what changed or what is currently the major miner system. For example, major vulnerability, huge damage nerf. I mean, this alone, I mean, there's a lot of other changes that brought down the ceiling quite a bit, but major vulnerability, the nerf from 30% to 10% damage done, or increase this target damage taken done, is like, it's so significant that I highly doubt any score pushing group will be able to beat any world record pre-Markarth for a time. Just this alone is so huge and so significant. And the fact that it was changed as to how it's applied, like there's no more cooldown on Colossi, basically, in terms of you cast it, then you gotta wait a little bit for the cooldown, and then you gotta cast another one. This also forces you to reconsider, okay, now the classes may need to change in number. For example, you may need to have 4 Magic Necromancers, or 4 Necros total in a group, to maintain a really good uptime of major vulnerability, instead of the previous 3, or potentially 2, that was supplemented by sets like Deadwater's Guile last patch. Anyway, the next tidbit of information we need to talk about is Brittle. Who does it? And, people also keep asking me, oh, is, Frost Magden DPS viable? Absolutely is viable. Is Frost Necromancer DPS viable? Absolutely is viable. But when we're talking about optimization and, min-maxing DPS or whatever, it's going to go to the supports. Now, when we talk about supports, is it going to be a Warden off-healer? Is it going to be a Necro off-healer? Is it going to be a Warden tank? From the uptimes we've kind of tested on both the tank and the healer, probably the most consistent uptimes, depending on the fights, will most likely go to a Warden or Necro off-healer. However, the downside of going a Necro off-healer to maintain minor brittle, which is, by the way, 10% more... 10% more crit damage on a target, which is really significant. The downside of going a Necro on that is that you don't have minor toughness, and also you'll probably sacrifice Empowering Grasp, which I'll talk about here in a bit. It's a pretty significant skill. Probably double Frost Staff, Charge Shock Enchant on one, and Infuse Frost Staff on the other. I'll also go into the details of how you would maintain this in a bit, because a lot of people have been asking, okay, well, if it's a healer, what's the setup? Okay, if it's a tank, what's the setup? Is it a 1 Ice Staff bar, a back bar, or whatever? You can do that. We're seeing about 60 to 80% on Warden tanks, I think, if you just 1 bar Frost Staff, but that's kind of wildly inconsistent for my taste when score pushing. So we pretty much kind of decided that it's going to go to a support, but most likely a group healer or off healer. Anyway, moving on, 3 more tidbits of information that you need to know about. Pale Order, Ring of the Pale Order. This is a really strong mythic, as evident by a lot of the Vateshran Hollow Spirit Slayers and so forth. And we have done some preliminary testing on this, and we could definitely see a return of Blood for Blood, but also, not just that, a lot of people kind of aren't really talking about this. And for good reason. It's risky, but Simmering Frenzy can definitely be considered when using Ring of the Pale Order. Simmering Frenzy is basically where you get 600 plus weapon or spell damage, and the longer you keep it on, obviously the lower your health goes at a faster rate. But this is risky, and this is more for score pushing, and I think this is something we still need to experiment on, but definitely don't sleep on this. Pearl of Elnafay. When I first tested this on the PTS, it was kind of ridiculous, but then I believe they adjusted it after it, but it's still pretty good. This could potentially allow someone to cast an ultimate every other ultimate. Most likely this will go on a support. That support, whether it's a healer or a tank, will most likely sacrifice a monster set depending on the itemization composition. Most likely a monster set will be sacrificed, but I don't think that's too big of a deal depending on your ultimate order, but definitely something you just can't really ignore this patch either. Empowering Grasp, I mentioned this when we were talking about Warden and Necro. Empowering Grasp basically makes Gallonway. This is another reason why Gallonway I don't think is really going to be needed in groups that will score push, because you're basically replacing a 5-piece item slot for a skill that can be easily kept up by a Necromancer off tank or a Necromancer healer. If there was this whole discussion about like, oh well, what if there's no necromancer tanks or healers? I mean, back then in Morrowind there were no Warden healers except me and some like other people. So I mean, that's just kind of like whatever. If you're not optimizing, don't care about it. The discussion ends there. In terms of DPS itemization, support itemization, and pre-buff sets, oh boy, there's gonna be a lot of stuff we're gonna have to talk about here. So DPS itemization for Magicka can obviously still include last patches, like, oh, maybe you want to split up Zen's Redress and Martial Knowledge amongst the DPS. Oh, Sorority is obviously still really good. Mother Sorrow, really good. Perfected False God, Advancing Yokita, Perfected False God is obviously still pretty solid for DPSing. Advancing Yokita, Reliquin is like off the charts for stam DPSing with target wise. Medusa, magic DPS. Now, a lot of people are also asking me about Maw versus Zan versus Alambris. Maw is pulling about 1 to 1.5k DPS behind Zan. So it was fixed in the context of its burning damage being fixed, which was basically a nerf. It's still an okay set to run, but you'd probably still run Zan where applicable. Damihas is also something I didn't put here, but Damihas is a really good monster set to look at depending on the fights. The Bloodthirsty trait, now, people still keep asking. Asian God made a write-up on this post Stonethorn. It's pretty much still true. I mean, Bloodthirsty, for most scenarios, are going to be it for anything, honestly. Especially if you're, burning a boss. Leviathan mostly for trash for stam. Now I'm gonna talk about trash setup for stam. It's very open-ended. We're still testing a lot of stuff. Some people are trying out Leviathan, Sogvin. Some people are trying out Mechanical Acuity plus something else. Some people are trying out actually a pretty good item set that one person in your group can definitely try out because of how the item set works is Azure Blight in a stam or even mag composition. Definitely pulls a lot of AoE DPS, so that's something one can look at. Deadwater's Guile is definitely an option still for both Magicka and stamina DPS grade compositions. It's just a shit ton of ultimate gained for anyone, and obviously it's more a matter of how and when you use this, more so than, oh, it's absolutely BIS everywhere. So definitely take that into consideration. Really good for, trials with trash fights, most likely. And of course, as we tested last patch in VMAW, it's pretty solid. Okay, Master Architect or War Machine. I still get questions about these two sets. Now, Master Architect or War Machine can still be used as pre-buff sets, but I'll get into that later. If you don't know what a pre-buff set is, definitely check out another link in the description down below explaining what pre-buff sets are. But this is mostly for PC players, not console players, because PC players do have access to add-ons like Alpha Gear, Dressing Room that make it possible for these sets to be used as pre-buff sets. So I would ignore that if you're a console player. Anyway, Master Architect War Machine, it is definitely a DPS loss for a stamina or Magicka DPS composition to have 2 or 3 or even 3 or 4 DPS in Master Architect War Machine. It's definitely DPS loss. So for example, if you're a stamina DPS and you're required to wear War Machine and Advancing Yokita instead of Reliquin Advancing Yokita, obviously that's a DPS loss. Whether that's a DPS loss for the group or too much of a DPS loss for the group, it's kind of a matter of debate at this point. Which is why whenever you can, most likely especially for Magicka DPS compositions, definitely wear Warring Opportunist on one support. Zen's Redress, this can also be worn on a support or a DPS, as I mentioned earlier with the Martial Knowledge split. Morag Tongue, Alkosh, Marsalok, this is going to be situational or dependent on the fights, as I'll explain here in a bit. Support itemization, oh boy, so yeah, there's a lot more here. Roaring Opportunist, Martial Knowledge, Zen's Redress, Morag Tongue, Powerful Assault, Elemental Callus, Worm Cult, this is kind of like a maybe. Hersing's Veneer or Ebon Armory. It's these two sets, I mean, they sound pretty good on paper. These two sets are not really going to be needed for either, Ebon especially won't be needed for either Stam or Magicka DPS compositions, because you do have minor toughness from Warden, that's enough usually. For all the content at the moment, you don't really need Ebon, especially if you're score pushing to min-max sets and stuff like that. Hersing's Veneer for Stam DPS composition, sustain on most Stam DPS classes right now are pretty insane. So you don't really need Hersing's Veneer. Worm Cult, it again depends on, I guess, the fight, or if you even have room for it, but I don't think this is truly needed, depending on how long the fights are for Magic DPS compositions. Again, this also depends on content as well, as I mentioned before. Now, Alkosh, we already talked about this, so we'll move on here. Yonakrin, still a pretty solid staple minor courage set to run. Tremor Scale, absolutely mandatory for stamina DPS compositions for the main thing to wear. It's just too free. It's just too much free penetration for nothing. You just taunt and that's it. Symphony, now again, we do have to, take into account that minor lifesteal does not proc Symphony, so Symphony will have to go on most likely an active healer, whether it's an active healing tank or an active healing group healer, but most likely the group healer who will wear also Symphony, Olorime, or SPC. Now, I wanted to make a video on this last patch because a lot of people are still confused. Well, when do I run Olorime? When do I run Subhard Cure? For most scenarios, it seemed like SPC was just better. It's just too much. It's just easier, and Olorime has that 1 second delay between 6 people taking it and the other 6 people taking it, which may not be realistic depending on the circumstances of the fight. Like, VA is hard mode, so I don't know if this is going to change, but I think SPC is still most likely the more likely winner here, unless you want to try out something really interesting, perhaps with having Olorime on the tank instead of a healer, but that's something we can kind of reserve for more theory crafting later on. Yorvolds is going to be mostly paired with Roaring Opportunist here up at the top, because it does extend the duration of Major Slayer, and it is quite significant of an increase to Major Slayer. Last patch I did describe that we tried out Zen Roaring Opportunist. That's fine too, but that's more for shorter fights. For longer fights, you'll definitely want Roaring Opportunist and Zen. Anyway, going on to Holofang. Holofang is still a pretty solid sustain set to have in a Mag DPS group, but again, due to the whole thing with Elemental Catalyst and Martial Knowledge, and Zen's Redress, the Elemental Catalyst being introduced in Stone kind of made itemization a little bit more cramped. So that's something you'll have to consider on your own. Defiled Dragon. This is still actually a pretty solid set for tanks to run depending on the trash setups. It's AoE Minor Breach, and Minor Breach was again buffed. Scavenging Demise. This was used primarily in VA's hard mode occasionally. Still kind of debatable this patch. Earthgore and Troll King. So this is more situational or niche situations like healing people out of ice tombs and locuses or whatever. Bicosa and Mending. We gotta actually talk about this because not a lot of people are talking about Major and Minor Cowardice. Mathematically speaking, I'm pretty sure it's better than the current Minor Maim, Major Maim system, which is like literally nothing. Like, for example, Minor Maim went from 15% to 5%. Major Maim also kind of, I believe it's 25%, 10% or something like that, whatever. But anyway, the Minor Maim alone, a lot of you guys who've been tanking maybe this patch have noticed a spike in damage increase. I mean, it's really significant. A lot of people don't understand the formula behind damage mitigation, but Minor Maim comes first in that formula. Basically, if you change the value of Minor Maim, you're gonna take more damage, period. And that 15% damage reduction was very significant, as some of you have experienced this patch. So depending on this setup, again, we don't really exactly need Alkosh for Magic DPS compositions. So maybe if your progression group needs like more survivability for your tanks, Bane's Torment has come up as an option, or Vicosa has come up as an option, or other things like that provide major cowardice, minor cowardice, like, the set Mending. Although I think just Mending, I don't think Mending as a set is really worth it anymore. I think just having an infused weakening chant for damage mitigation will more than compensate for the lack of Mending, in conjunction with having Bicosa or Bane's Torment, depending on the scenario. But otherwise, for score pushing groups, I think this will only be absolutely used for very high damage scenarios like Kyne's Aegis, last boss. Torgs, I just don't see the room for Torgs, honestly, for the most part. Livewire, don't really see the room for there. Malakat's Band of Brutality, this is primarily used by tanks to buff the Alkosh initial hit, which gives more armor shred or armor penetration for the group. You can only really use this for you can use this for either a mag or stamina DPS composition. You can't really use this in a stam DPS raid composition because you can't sacrifice tremor scale as a main tank, right? And you can't obviously wear it as a stam DPS if you wish to provide Alkash to the group. So that's not a very good thing to use on a stamina DPS boss fight. For a magic DPS composition, this can be used on either a boss fight or trash, but for stamina, definitely gonna be, you know, for trash only. Vadashra and Destro, this is gonna be, so Vadashra and Destro, a lot of people have been asking me what my thoughts are. I've tested this on PTS. Particularly for PvP, it's pretty good. For PvE, not a lot of people seem to know how to, you know, work this in, but potentially for like Elemental Catalyst or Zen's redress setup, and one of my healers from Berserk tested this actually with great results. Vadashra and Destro can definitely be used for a setup like this, and as you can see, Faded Kitty 4, she got like upwards of 90, 80, 95% minor brittle uptimes on targets in both raids and outside of raids. So as a Warden healer, mind you, and a bar sub like that could work if you're specifically for a stam DPS composition, if you're going to be doing a Elemental Catalyst Zen. We'll talk more about this in a bit. Pre-buff sets, like I mentioned, if you're a console player, you can just skip this part. But for PC players, yes, pre-buff sets, despite the death of our cases, it's still pre-buff sets are still here. But yeah, rip our cases. If you guys don't know how broken our cases was, well, let me show you. This was our score push last patch, going for a world record. We didn't get it, but this is how our cases work. Everyone is formed or arrayed in a specific position or in this line. And as you pre-buff the other sets like Moondancer or Yearvolds, you'll notice that everyone pops a potion here at a specific time and alt, which means, as you can see here, that's 2 Destros, or what should have been 2 Destros per person should have gone off at the same time. So basically you could get 2 Destros at the start of the fight per person. Well, that's gone now. Our cases, as a pre-buff set, is pretty much freaking dead. However, the other pre-buff sets like Moondancer or Yearvolds, Master Architect, War Machine, where you use these sets instead of slapping on DPS, or even having Roaring Opportunist for, you know, sub 1 minute some fights, it's gonna be used as a pre-buff set. Damihas is also a pre-buff set you could proc, 7th Legion, Sench's Blight, but yeah. So now that we got a lot of puzzle pieces together, let's actually talk about the compositions. I know that was a lot of information to kind of take, but let's talk about the actual raid compositions. One more thing before we move on though, duration. So we did test this last patch, and I forgot to mention it. It's viable, for sure. It's viable for optimization, is what I'm saying. You could definitely use this post for a large trash pool and keep it until the end of the trial. Like for example, a couple of our DPS did try it out post boss 2 in VHAF, and definitely it's a bit risky, but it could definitely pay off in terms of pushing the score. But anyway, here's basically what's gonna shape up to be for probably the next patch to come, maybe, I don't know. But which one for what? Which composition for what content? Now, last patch I said, I think Magicka and Stamina are pretty freaking close. And this patch with certain changes to, like, you know, 10% nerf to the ranged light attacks, which I don't agree with personally, because Magicka DPS can also be melee, but that's a whole different conversation for another time. In addition to other changes, like for stamina DPS, I think the balance between the two have actually been, it's actually pretty close in disparity. You can definitely argue that stamina can definitely be better than Magicka depending on the content. Not only will your raid compositions depend on your group skill level, but also on the content. For example, I think for Craglorns, stamina. I think stamina will definitely be a very, very good competitor against Mag for score pushing. VMAW, stamina, or Magicka, but this is kind of weird, but we did try testing stamina in VMAW early on in this patch. Obviously, very messy because people are still transitioning from Magicka to stamina or vice versa. However, the more I thought about certain polls and trash stuff like that, I think VMAW is kind of leaning towards Magicka, just because of the way we pull trash to speed up the time. So That's definitely something you need to consider too. Not just the whole fact that, oh, stamina and DPS go brr, so it's better, or magic DPS has more boss cleave, so it's better. You can't really think in in that kind of small-mindedness. You gotta think about everything. You gotta think about trash pulls. You gotta think about how you do those trash pulls. You gotta think about how you do boss fights. You also gotta think about a whole variety of other things. But anyway, I think for VMAW, it's gonna lean towards Magicka for score pushing. For Vet Sunspire, this is kind of debatable. A lot of people said, oh, stamina is not really worth it in Sunspire because of the lack of cleave. But that's a very easily fixable issue that we found. We've definitely found it easily fixable on both Unicrit and Locacy for the Atronex. That's whatever. So this is kind of like a toss-up between stamina and magic DPS groups going for score. But I think for most groups, as I said earlier, most groups will still go mag, regardless of whether stamina is best in slot for score pushing for certain content or not, because it's simply easier or to organize, it's simply safer. Qkiie's Aegis, Magicka for sure for score pushing. There's I just okay, if you wanna clear Qkiie's Aegis or even Qkiie's Aegis hard mode on stam, it's doable. You can do it. But for score pushing, I don't know about that one. That's pretty sus. Vet Cloud Rest, Magicka, for sure. I just don't think stamina DPS compositions are worth it at all to score push in either Qkiie's Aegis or Cloud Rest. It's just too risky. It's just not there. It's just not there. VHAV, Stamina or Magicka. Leaning towards Stamina for a variety of reasons. It's mostly a single target based trial. The trash cleave between Mag and Stam are actually comparable, whether you're doing bow, two-hander bow, whatever, versus double inferno, or one lightning, one inferno. It's just mostly a single target trial. You can argue maybe boss 4 Magicka wins out a bit more, but at the same time, you can still do the burn on the boss 4 pretty easily on Stam as well. So that's something to consider. But yeah, I think both Magic and Stamina can be competitive in VHAV, but I think we're going to be leaning towards more Stamina for that. VAS, Stamina, or Magicka. Stamina can go bow. The Battleshred bow, we haven't fully tested it yet, but could definitely be something that worth checking out. But I think due to how the fight is, I think it's going to lean towards Magicka. But yeah, this is something you guys can consider for yourselves. Obviously, I'm not telling you, oh, you have to do Stamina DPS for Craglorns. Oh, you have to do Magicka for, like Sunspire. It's up to you. But otherwise, this is kind of what I'm like thinking in terms of score pushing. For the themes, and I'm gonna talk about this because I keep touching upon this concept. Magicka compositions has less complications with itemization. What does that mean? It means because just the nature of certain sets like Elemental Catalyst and stuff like that. I mean, it's less of a bother to put Elemental Catalyst on the Magicka DPS composition than it is on the Stamina DPS composition. I'll touch on this here in a bit. Stamina composition, on the other hand, has less complication with classes. So if you look at the minor, buffs and so forth that each class brings, you'll notice something pretty peculiar. Dragon Knight has Stagger, Minor Brutality, which is, weapon damage. We also have Templar with Minor Sorcery, Minor Fracture Breach, which, by the way, has been, again, kind of replaced by Pierce Armor, depending on the fights. But they don't really give... Templars don't give anything to Stam groups. Warden, yeah, sure, you'll still bring a Warden to... probably Warden support, healer or tank to, the Stam DPS compositions. Sorcerer, you don't really need it for Stam composition. Necromancer, of course you'll need it for the major vulnerability. Nightblade, Minor Savage, yeah. But other than that, compared to a Magicka DPS composition, you need a Dragon Knight for Engulfing Flames, Stagger, potentially igneous weapons for using Heroism Pots. You need a Templar for Minor Sorcery. You need a Warden for the Minor Toughness, Major Resolve, Minor Vulnerability. You need a Necromancer for Major Vulnerability. And you need a Sorcerer. You guys can see where I'm going with this. So basically, Magic comps, no issues really with itemization, but can get complicated with classes. Stamina, much more simple with classes than Magicka, but can be more complicated with itemization. And again, as I said, I'm going to repeat this, Magicka is still favorable for most prog groups. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's just more safer and more simpler. Endgame progression groups, meaning score pushing groups, we'll see use for both stamina and magic DPS compositions. So let me get into why stamina can be a little complicated with itemization. So here's two examples, right? You can see that if we decide to not put War Machine on, if we decide to put War Machine on 3 or whatever DPS for stamina, you'll see this is how we arrange things for Sunspire or for Gase or Attempt or something. Main tank could wear Yonokrin MK or Morag. Off tank can wear Alkosh or whatever else. The main healer can wear SPC or PA or something like that. It's pretty simple because you're putting the Source of Mage's Slayer on the DPS. However, with this setup, once you start putting RO into the support itemization, things get a little weird here because now you have things like, oh, well, okay, main tank can do something like Yonokrin Martial Knowledge or something like that just to compensate for the RO. And you also notice here that we still don't have room for Yorvolds. So it's a matter of debate if you want to say, stam compositions may need 3 War Machine. That makes it less DPS than Magicka, which I don't think is necessarily true, but you can see just from this how messy it can get with itemization for stam compositions. But yeah, for example, this is going to be our current stamina DPS itemization for supports or whatever vital sets we need. For example, on Locustees, main tank's going to wear Yo Morang, off tank's going to wear PA Alkosh, and this is assuming you put 3 War Machine on DPS, and then you'll see that the vital sets we need will need to split up a little bit here, potentially with Morag Tong, which is absolutely needed, in my opinion, to min-max the stamina DPS composition, maybe Alkosh because you can't flank dragons, and so forth. So, and if you are doing War Machine on DPS, you are experiencing DPS loss, which is going to be AY War Machine. But then there's also that new Valashran Arena Dual weapon that is still bugged, and we haven't been able to test that. So that could definitely be a consideration potentially. Instead of doing like AY jewelry and weapons, you could do 2 AY body and jewelry with Valashran Dual with no monster set. That's something worth testing out, and again, that's something I kind of alluded to earlier in saying that, you know, we haven't been able to test a lot more stuff that we would like to have tested, so things could become more relevant or irrelevant. Anyway, before we move on to the examples for stamina or Magicka DPS compositions, I want to talk about mixed compositions, and some of you may have seen this conversation between me and Professor Hibio in the ESO University Discord, where we were discussing, you know, compositions, and the mixed composition thing came up. If you want to do mixed compositions, sure, go for it. Is it going to be optimal? Probably not. This was Hibio's recommended one, and I personally don't agree with this because you could definitely put, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about this now. You could definitely put, you know, Battleship Destro EC Zen on a off healer instead of doing RO Yorvolds. I don't know. I don't know. And there's no Tremor, but again, mixed compositions, it kind of gets a bit hectic here too in terms of itemization, and it gets weird in terms of the. I don't know. I just don't think mixed compositions is gonna be optimal still. I mean, that would be awesome if it was, but I just don't see it. Since we've kind of solved with this composition the issue of, okay, who's gonna maintain brittle, etc. for a stam composition, or mostly stam composition. So let's move on. So last part of the video, I have no idea how long I've been talking for. But sorry if this is a lengthy video, but again, this is a really open-ended video. As you can see from Hibio's composition, a lot of things can appear to work, and a lot of things can appear to not work or be optimal. So again, there's a lot of testing we still need to do, but again, yeah, let's keep going. For a general Magicka DPS example, now a lot of people are asking, what's the hardest hitting Magicka DPS? What's the hardest hitting stamina DPS? Let's talk about Magicka first. It seems from preliminary testing that macros are actually on par or better than Magblades compared to last patch, which is very interesting. Whether they're ahead of Magdecays or Magplars or Magcircles or whatever, that remains to be seen. But if macros are the hardest hitting class, you can do something like this, since you already are going to have a minimum of at least 3 necromancers, 3 to 4 necromancers for the major vulnerability uptime, and you ideally do want 4 horns now because of the way Colossi work as of the Markarth DLC patch. You're gonna have something like a Dragon Knight main tank, Yo Alkosh, Malakath, or Yo Alkosh, whatever else. Necrosorc or Templar off tank for the minor passives, or Empowering Grasp. Warden Templar or Necro Group Healer for the Empowering Grasp or passives. Warden Necro off healer for the passives or Empowering Grasp. Plus, if you need to keep up, Zan Callist or whatever. So we got 4 macros if you want to rotate the Colossi between 4 or 3. Depending on the fight, we got macro or magblade, macro or magblade, macro or magblade, or macro, magblade, or max or DK. Again, we're mostly fitting the minors here, not really the items here. For the general stamina composition example, what's the hardest hitting one? We actually did have one person in our raid team test out Stamblade. It didn't seem to be as great as we thought it could be. Obviously, this is from Sunspire alone. It could definitely be as noted here, if maybe like a really weird idea here potentially, but if you don't want to wear Alkosh for Stam, you could stack mostly Stam blades, but I don't know if that'd be potentially worth it. But that could potentially also free up a 5-piece for Roaring Opportunist or Stam DPS compositions. I don't know, but it seems like Stamblade is kind of underperforming compared to Stam Crow. We haven't been able to test Stam Den yet, or Stamina Warden yet. Obviously, I always get kind of cautious whenever Stamina Warden is doing really well on a dummy, on a raid dummy, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, let's do Stamina Warden." Every time we bring it in, it's just not working or whatever. But potentially, Stamina Warden could definitely be the hardest hitting Stam class this patch. Templar seems to be doing exceptionally well, obviously from both from DPS single target and AOE. Stamsorc is also seems to be doing decent as well. But I wouldn't necessarily put Stamblade away just yet. But anyway, this is a general stamina example. DK or Nightblade main tank, Necro DK, Sorc off tank, Necro group healer, Warden off healer, 3 to 4 Stam Crows, or depending on what's hitting the hardest, you could stack all Stam Crows, you could stack some Stam Crows with some Stamdens or whatever. You get the idea. But anyway, that's all I'm gonna pretty much talk about here. If you guys have any questions, I know this was a long video. Let me know in the comments below or in the ESO University Discord. If you're not in the Discord, you definitely should be. We're actually approaching 12,000 people in there, and people talk about stuff like this all the time. But yeah, again, a really open-ended patch for raiding this patch. It's a shame though that we keep crashing. It's probably one of the worst patches in terms of performance for a potentially really fun patch in terms of theory crafting and raiding. So that's disappointing, but hopefully the issues get resolved on every platform server and we can continue with more raiding. As of now, I am aware that a lot of raid teams are canceling raids or just doing casual raids or whatever. Not really score pushing. A lot of raid teams have decided to kind of take a hiatus. My raid team personally, we've kind of canceled raids until the next incremental, so yeah. Hopefully you guys take a lot of information away from this video, and do stay safe. Hopefully you guys had a great Thanksgiving, and hopefully you have a great rest of the year if we don't see each other before the end of the year. Stay safe, have fun, and see you guys next time.